The Progressive Era was a time of reforms to solve problems. The roots of these problems began many years before during the Gilded Age, when politicians rewarded their supporters with governmental jobs and business was based off trust. In 1881, President James Garfield was assassinated because he wouldn't give Charles Boulet a job he didn't deserve. After Garfield's death, Charles Arthur became president and passed the Pendleton Act, which established civil service. Federal workers would have to take exams, so they would only be given jobs they were qualified for. Because of these causes to the Progressive Era, a group of reformers made up of writers and journalists called muckrakers formed. The names of these muckrakers were Lincoln Steffens, who wrote Shame of Cities, dealing with corruption in politics; Jacob Rice, who wrote How the Other Half Lives, dealing with living conditions in the tenements; John Spargo, who wrote Bitter Cries of Children, dealing with child labor; Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle, dealing with dangerous working conditions; Ida B. Wells, who wrote Red Record, dealing with lynching of African Americans; and Ida Tarbell, who wrote History of Standard Oil, dealing with the company's ruthless tactics. These reformers pushed for change, and after many had read these reformers' work, they grew disgusted with corruption in both government and big business. A reform governor, Robert M. La Follette, came up with the Wisconsin idea, where he hired experts to improve his state's government. Soon many other states followed. With the help of William S. Ewing, Oregon adopted 4 election reforms. They were the secret ballot, where voters individually vote in a private booth; initiative, giving voters the right to propose legislature; recall, which granted voters the right to remove elected officials; and direct primary, which voters could choose their candidates for office rather than political party leaders. The direct primary led to the adoption of the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, giving Americans the ability to directly elect their state senators. After all these new changes, the time felt right for the United States to have a progressive president, and Theodore Roosevelt came forward. Roosevelt succeeded President McKinley after his assassination. In 1901, Roosevelt came up with many progressive reforms and announced his plan, the Square Deal, to the public. When Roosevelt became president, 80% of business was owned by trust. Roosevelt began suing businesses that proved to have become monopolies. America gave Roosevelt the nickname Trustbuster because he was the first president to enforce the Sherman Antitrust Act. Roosevelt continued eliminating bad trusts and regulating the good trust in business. He began gaining more support, which allowed him to pass his laws. After Roosevelt's re-election, he passed the Hepburn and Elkin Act, which gave the Federal Interstate Commerce Commission the power to regulate the maximum fee railroads could charge. Roosevelt then changed his attention from trust to public health after reading The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. After proving Sinclair's claims true, he passed the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act, which guaranteed safe and sanitary meat, and manufacturers had to list the contents in food and drugs on labels. Roosevelt then became interested in protecting America's natural resources when he saw them being squandered. Roosevelt once said, "What will happen when our forests are gone, when the coal, the iron, the oil, and the gases are exhausted?" Roosevelt wanted conservation, the preserve of natural resources, and the environment to be used wisely. Roosevelt's second term was coming to an end now, and since running for a third term was untraditional, he handpicked his successor. In 1908, William Howard Taft won the election. Taft shared the same progressive beliefs as Roosevelt, but he had a more conservative approach to reform. This disappointed the American public because they wanted radical change. Surprisingly, Taft had eliminated twice as much trust as Roosevelt did. But then Roosevelt returned from overseas and the public encouraged him to run for a third term. He did while forming his own party called the Progressive Party, also nicknamed the Bull Moose Party. He came up with a new platform called New Nationalism. The Democrat candidate Woodrow Wilson also promoted a platform called New Freedom. With the Republican Party vote divided between Taft and Roosevelt, Wilson won the election of 1912. President Wilson began his reforms by getting the Senate to pass the Underwood Tariff, which lowered tariff rates. Wilson then established a private banking system called the Federal Reserve, which allowed him to control the amount of money in circulation. Wilson then established the Federal Trade Commission and Clayton Antitrust Acts. They both helped the stopping of unfair business practices. Wilson, however, never tried to improve women's suffrage or segregation. In 1910, the NAACP had supported Wilson's presidency and felt they had been betrayed. There were still limits on progressivism, shown by Wilson's inaction on civil rights, but the progressive era showed the optimism of the American public that any problem can be solved. Even with Wilson's attempts to make improvements, the effects of the progressive era led to the emerge of class struggles and increase in unemployment. With the beginning of World War I in Europe, the United States had joined in, and this led America into an era of imperialism.